So that's basically it. My tentative title is What Hath More Wrought? And I want to talk about what I'm going to identify as cultural economics of risk, a neologism, anecdata, and AI. 3 different kinds of AI that I think are going to be directly relevant for everybody represented in this room. And to a very large extent, some of the themes I'm going to discuss, the poor people who are sitting next to me downstairs as we were talking about the history of derivatives and finance, they're going to see echoes of that in this talk. This is really the most important slide that I have. The content of the audience is more important than the content of the talk. I have near perfect knowledge of what I'm about to say, even though, in fact, I've put together some new things for this particular group. This is not a group, because Thornton assembled it, this is not a group that requires particular stimulation or convincing as to the importance of innovation. You're here because you're converts, and the issue is, to my mind, how well can we think about and rethink about what innovation can and should mean both to ourselves and our own organizations and to those organizations and individuals we are seeking to proselytize and convert and open up to deal with some of the key elements of risk. I was invited to give a talk to MIT's entrepreneur group last year, and in a fit of middle age, I decided to identify certain themes that really stuck with me as the most important things I felt I had learned working with a variety of organizations and individuals on innovation challenges and innovation issues. I'd like you to have these things in the back of your mind, moving slowly to the front as I whip through these slides. The first is that technology's value comes from transforming the economics of fundamentals. McKinsey has basically invented a very good perpetual motion business model. They centralize companies they once decentralized, and they decentralize companies they once centralized. And they can do this with a certain degree of intellectual integrity, and I mean no disrespect to the McKinsey alums or McKinsey clients among you, those who've been McKinsey'd, in that when you change the costs of communications and collaboration via technology, the economics of what makes sense to centralize and what makes sense to decentralize changes. I find the most fascinating impact of technology not on what technology can or cannot do, but rather how it changes the relative costs and benefits of things that organizations and individuals consider fundamental. Centralization, decentralization, automation, augmentation, etc. The second is, on average, character matters much more than intelligence. At risk of sounding personal, I come from an academic family. I'm sure this comes as a big shock to you. And I grew up in Hyde Park in Chicago, and, intellect was valued very, very much. Too much. And when I look at innovation failures or underperformance in organizations, it is not because our colleagues, our bosses, and our subordinates are too stupid or their IQs aren't as high as we'd like them to be. I think the reason, more often than not, are failures of character. There's a wonderful line from Joseph Schumpeter of creative destruction fame where he says, innovation isn't an act of intellect, it's an act of will. And the older I get, the more I believe that. You're welcome to disagree with that. This is particularly targeted to the overrepresentation of IT people in this room. Implementation isn't an act of conformance to requirements and plan. It's an act of discovery. It's remarkable what you discover in the course of trying to implement a system. Fortunately, there's some laughter, I assume, of recognition, not at the idea underlying this. There is no sustainable substitute for rigorous thinking. I'm saying rigorous thinking, not creative thinking, innovative thinking, blue sky thinking, rigorous thinking. We have many, many students at MIT who are superb computational thinkers. Their level of rigor, alas, underperforms their ability to compute. Actions speak louder than words or numbers. Innovations are not analyzed into existence, they're enacted. And I think that's imperative to understand. And I'll be very blunt. Smart people who are very good at analysis sometimes would rather analyze innovation potential rather than try something. And I want to talk about the economics of trying stuff. In fact, that's my background. My academic background, I look at the behavioral economics, not normative economics that we all studied in school, positive economics. I'm not interested in how people are supposed to behave. I'm interested in how people actually do behave. I'm sorry to tell you it took me until my 30s until I realized how important the actual behavior was as opposed to supposed behavior was. But I look at how organizations use models, prototypes, and simulations to manage innovation investment, innovation opportunity, and innovation risk. I'm stressing this because, as my wife and several former girlfriends will attest, I am, and you will come to discover, I am not a people person. I am not the person when it comes to, thank you for laughing on that, Thornton. I'm not the person you come to for motivation or inspiration. When I look at how organizations innovate, yes, I listen to people, I talk with people. Some of my best friends are people, but in fact, if you were to call me into your organization and we were to talk about innovation, what I'd really be asking is, show me the models, the prototypes, and the simulations that you build, and the experiments that you run on them, because that's going to be the window that I use to examine your innovation culture. Because otherwise, there's a certain degree of frustration associated with these things, and it is frustration. It is frustrating, and so with that kind of backdrop, I want to deal with what I think is increasingly going to be the core theme that innovators will have to confront over the next 5 or so years. And I want to begin with this gentleman who everybody in this room recognizes. It's Warren Buffett. By the way, I love how, the sun, I'm counting on this pillar to block off, the pillar in the clouds to block off the sun. I actually, forgive my name dropping, I actually happen to know Mr. Buffett quite well because when I was a newspaper reporter for the Washington Post Company, he was on the board of the company. And one of the perks of being a reporter at the Post in the business desk is that we got to talk to Mr. Buffett during his, ABC Cap Cities acquisition, et cetera, et cetera. We met him at board meetings and stuff. He was always very nice and we've kept in touch over the years, and sadly, I didn't invest with him. But be that as it may, he's an exceptionally sharp and pithy person. He is the premier, paramount investor of the 20th century, and for the most part of the 21st century as well. And he is the paragon of fundamental investing, and he has a nice, simple, accessible face. By the way, if you haven't read some of the shareholders' letters he's written as chair of Berkshire Hathaway, well worth reading, because even though innovation is not his forte, his discussion and clarity around issues about value and financial value are just remarkable. And his definition of value investing was, how do you buy $1 for 50 cents? Okay? That's the essence of fundamental value investing. In the spirit of good artists borrow, great artists steal. I'm very interested in the issue of how do organizations do value innovating? What does value innovating mean? I think that the real challenge that organizations face is not how do we become more innovative. It's how do we do a better job of aligning innovation with risk. It's what I would call innovation risk management. In the same way there's no such thing as a free lunch, there's no such thing as a riskless innovation. And I think the real challenge we have in our organizations is how do we align what we think our risk appetites are and what our opportunities are with the kind of innovation search space and portfolios our capabilities and competencies allow us to pursue? And that's basically it. Innovation risk management. Cheap innovation, cost-effective innovation, best innovation value. How do we define how we wish to align innovation risk? I want to define my terms. How do I define innovation? It's the conversion of novelty into value. Now, needless to say, that begs the question of novel for whom and valuable to whom or for whom. But if there ain't novelty and there ain't value, it ain't innovation. It can be TQM, it can be SPC, it can whatever the acronym of the week may be, but what's the novelty, what's the value? And the other is, and this is shockingly obvious, but I think it has to be said, particularly for those of us who have academic affiliations, at MIT, as Jerry will vouch, you can be innovative for innovation's sake. In fact, you get tenure if you can be innovative. In business, innovation for the sake of innovation is self-indulgent. When organizations invite me in and say, Michael, we need to become more innovative, I swear to God, my immediate reaction is not how much. My immediate reaction is what for. Oftentimes, you get the clearest and cleanest and crispest delineation of what kind of innovation makes sense by pushing people to articulate their strategic motivation and their strategic intent. Is innovation an ingredient? Is it a spice? Or is it the whole meal in accomplishing the strategy? I think a lot of innovation initiatives fail because they fundamentally don't align, or they clarify the lack of alignment with what the organization espouses at its strategy and the allocation of its investment. True story, just as an aside, I have no shortage of friends at MIT. For reasons I won't bore you with, I happen to know the CIO of Walmart, actually various CIOs of Walmart. And there were a number of my friends at MIT who had excellent ideas in regards to loyalty programs, et cetera, and ultimately I would rapidly reach the frustration point of saying, excuse me, what is it about everyday low pricing that you don't understand? Because that's the Walmart strategy. They would have been better off pitching Tesco than Walmart. So if we're talking about innovation, it exists in the context of strategic ends, and that allows us to value things differently. And finally, innovation isn't what innovators innovate, it's what customers and clients adopt. Let me repeat that one more time. Innovation isn't what innovators innovate, it's what customers and clients adopt. Let me see if I can get my phone out here. Everybody has one of these, right? And this is a trick question for this crowd. How many of you use more than 30% of the features and functionality of your mobile device? How do you know? Now, with the School of Engineering, you know, it's a trade, because at MIT, the bulk of the hands go, but I've discovered, by the way, three categories. Anal retentives, engineers, and this is the fastest growing category. Parents who are programming the GPS function in their teenager cell phone to track them. Any of you done that? One hand up there, yes. Your child isn't here, so you don't have to acknowledge it.
He's using a Palm 5X right now.
I'm very impressed with the kind of technology he inflicts on his adolescents. But I think it's imperative. It's imperative that we begin to acknowledge a different axis or locus of value for innovation. I think we have to move away from, please don't hiss at the use of this word, the paradigm of innovation being about greater creation of choice, i.e., how can we add more features and functionality to a cell phone, to software, to a car, to how do people get greater value from use? Value from use. I've done work with Microsoft, I've done work with Nokia. They'll tell you that only a fraction of people use more than 20 to 25% of the features and functionality. True story, public story, I'm not violating any confidences here, and it's to their credit. Microsoft did a survey of asking its best customers for features and functionality for the Office suite. Okay? They did this worldwide, they got thousands of recommendations, they analyzed those recommendations. Guess what they discovered? 90% of the suggestions, they're already there. Okay? What is that now? No shame on Microsoft. Our issue is, how do people get access to it? How do they discover it? It's not that they weren't innovative. The customer isn't getting the value from it. Which, by the way, created a sort of an interesting death spiral because Microsoft is seen as not innovative. They've actually done the work. But too bad nobody can get access to it. So we're talking about customers. I feel obligated here. We all know who this gentleman is, Peter Drucker. There's only one valid definition of a business purpose: to create a customer. It is the customer who determines what a business is. I can't get any more politically correct than quoting Peter Drucker over dinner. Here's the snap and the tail we need to put into this. In my point of view on this, and I hope it's mildly controversial, is that there's a real asset when it comes to innovation, and it's not your people, and it's not your core competencies. Innovative firms need innovative customers. You can have the most creative, imaginative, hardworking, innovative people, but if your customers aren't willing to innovate or take a chance on your innovations, on your novelties, and convert them into value, or they simply see additional features and functionality, instead of seeing value from use, they see bloatware or complexity and expense, I'm sorry, you're not innovative. You may be inventive, you may be creative, but as far as your customer is concerned, you're full of it. Who are your most innovative customers, and how do you know? I want to define what a innovative customer is, because I think operational definitions are important. And I won't read the details here, but this goes right back to Econ 101. It goes away from the notion that economics is about allocative efficiencies and towards the notion that James Buchanan, Ronald Coe's notion, yes, I am a University of Chicago kind of guy, that it's about exchange. There's a risk associated with innovation. What do I get in exchange? What's the exchange? This is about individuals and institutions doing exchange. What's the cost-benefit ratio? And what are the dimensions of risk that determine? How expensive is it to test out Google or Bing? The cost is your time. Actually, the Google-Bing trade-off is a very interesting one. Do you feel like you're not getting as good as search and Google? I know everybody. How many of you have tried Bing? Great. How many of you have tested your search, just informally, tested your research results against Bing and Google? Almost the same. It's not a cost investment. It's a time investment. And, maybe for certain things, you'll kick over. Now when money's involved, things get even more interesting. Of course, now we'll get back. It's even more interesting if other people are paying. But still, these are the kinds of issues. Innovation is about a risk exchange as it relates to perceived value. And just to get to the punchline, and then I'll accelerate through all of this, this is the innovation challenge. This is what market segmentation, personalization, and customization is going to be about in every industry that matters in the next 10 to 15 years. How do we right-size customer innovation risk? That's it. Screw the issue of value associated with it. What kind of risks are we asking our customers to take with our innovations? Are we asking them to try out this new feature, try out this new functionality? Is the core value proposition choice, or is it value from use? How do we know? How do we measure? This, by the way, is why I think the Web 2.0 model is such a great model. Because if there's a single thing Web 2.0 allows you to do, it's analyze usage and track it and aggregate it and slice it and dice it. I'd rather have that than SAP or Oracle Financials. Okay? My own bias. And besides, they're not a sponsor, right, Thornton? And so what I'm going to talk about here is that there's this very interesting, there's this wonderful line from Kenneth Boulding that you can divide the world, there are two kinds of people in the world, those who divide the world into two groups of people and those who don't. I think the interesting schism that's occurred in innovation is what I call Moore's Law versus Moody's Flaw. What's Moore's Law and Moody's Flaw? Nice rhyming there. It's exponential innovation and credentialed innovation. The financial services industry had enormous innovation. The subprime mortgage was a remarkable innovation. The derivatives based on it, we were talking about downstairs, a remarkable innovation. But you know what? somehow the rating agencies decided to give a AAA rating to something that had, for want of a better phrase, no track record and no history that other instruments could have. So something that they sold it as an innovation. It was a AAA innovation. Talk about a paradigm shift. Okay? But this is one of the big tensions that we face. What is the nature of the performance? I'm pretty confident when I look at an Intel microprocessor or a Nokia phone what the performance is. Who do I have to credere, to trust, to believe? Who do I have to trust? Word of mouth? For other kinds of innovations. So I've got the opportunities of exponentialism, and I've got the issue of who do I trust on this. You know what? Most people are better off trusting Intel than Moody's. Sad story. Something to discuss over dinner. But I'm very intrigued, as I think everybody in this room knows, by the whole notion, not that I'm intrigued, that you all are as well, that Moore's law and Metcalfe's law, about networks, these have transformed the economics of innovation and risk for us. And there's this other phenomenon that I observe when people talk about innovation and risk, and I like creating neologisms. I'm calling them narrow data and anecdata and data. What I observed, and this is in the same spirit of Kenneth Boulding, there are people, like the folks at Google, they're data-driven. They launch something and they look at the data. But, I've been, and this is one of the reasons my back is killing, I've been to Africa, I've been to Europe, I've been working with a variety of companies, and these are people who are quantitatively gifted, or at least quantitatively competent. But, you want to effectively communicate and rhetorically persuade? They like stories. They like innovation stories. If you want to persuade somebody, you don't show them beautiful charts or beautiful spreadsheets. You tell them stories. Or better yet, you get key customers to tell the innovation stories. And I think, again, culturally, one of the cultural, economic, organizational challenges we have is what is the balance? If we have an indifference curve with data-driven and story-driven, or data-driven and analogy-driven, data-driven, vignette-driven, what does that indifference curve look like? How, in our organizations, do we use a mix of data and stories to persuade internally and externally? Because the rhetoric of innovation plays an enormous role in shaping the perceived risk of innovation. Here are the three kinds of AI that I believe are transforming the economic opportunities and the perceived risks associated with innovation. I just realized I should have put in a new slide here. The first is the notion that with new modeling technologies, CATIA, Google SketchUp, all this kind of thing, our ability to iterate, our ability to do more versions per unit time of a chip, of a financial product, of an automobile design, of anything, our ability to do more versions per unit time has accelerated. And the key is not doing the number of versions, it's what do we want to learn per version done? What is our ROI? Not return on investment. What's our return on iteration? You know what another word for return on iteration is? Learning. Learning. What do we want to learn? By the way, who do we want to learn with? Do we want to do ROIs just inside our own organization, or do we want to do it with key suppliers and key customers? Eric von Hippel, lead user research at MIT. Terrific stuff in that regard. I think Olin engineering department needs to look at this kind of concern. I think the other dimension, I did a piece on this for the Financial Times, advancing interoperability. Everybody knows in this room knows what a mashup is. What happens when we begin to mash up Google Maps and our iPhones with our automobiles, with our pacemakers? What happens when we start putting, we have the accelerometer in our pacemaker that matches up with the accelerometer in our iPhone? Or indeed, maybe the accelerometer in our iPhone gets connected virtually to our pacemaker so that if we fall down quickly, an emergency message gets sent to the right person. It used to be that product designers would optimize, understandably, optimize the products, the performance of the product they're trying to build. But if our ability to link products and services, our ability to create not just data exchange, but interoperate products and services, our notion of what's the objective function to optimize changes. The notion of making it easier and reducing the risk for our customers to figure out, ooh, if I have this and I'm more likely to buy what you're putting out because it's easy for me to connect to all this other stuff I've invested in. So you've now turned your innovation from a variable cost to a marginal cost because of its powers of interoperability. I think interoperability is absolutely key. And I grew up, when I went to school, we didn't have, in systems engineering, we didn't talk about interoperability. You know what we talked about? Systems integration. But optimizing integration is not the same as optimizing interoperability. It's a different design sensibility. And it's a design sensibility that everybody in the web world understands, but not everybody, but fewer people in structural engineering and more traditional engineering disciplines have not focused as much upon. And the final AI is automated improvisation. Yes. In the same way that Google automates search, I think we're going to have, for want of a better phrase, genetic algorithms, neural net algorithms, generating improvised innovation offers that force innovative people to evaluate, geez, should we productize this? Should we servicize this? As we make our systems smarter, as we make our systems, our interoperable networks, more self-diagnostic, it's going to, and we ask them to generate, gee, what's a solution to this? What's an approach to this? We're changing the nature of the risk-reward ratio of how we uncover innovation opportunities. When I work with organizations, just to pull back, what I have found to be most effective is I get people to ask simple questions, come up with simple hypotheses, and ask simple experiments. Because the underlying technologies are complicated and complex. But there are platforms, there are substrates, there are tools for innovation. Increasingly, I think our roles as innovators, we have to come up with the complexity that facilitates this, but our role to get value from these tools and technologies and platforms is what are our simple and simplicity angles of attack. The technique I've used with a number of organizations is that we organize what I call 5x5 X teams. You give 5 people 5 days to come up with 5 experiments. The experiment can't cost more than $5,000 to do. It can't take more than 5 weeks to run. And you have to build a business case for $5 million in savings or savings or growth. I'm not in love with the number 5. I recognize, as does everyone in this room, that ingenuity doesn't come from freedom. It comes from constraints. When you push people to design within constraints. And let's do some simple math. If you have 5 teams coming up with 25 ideas, 5 teams with 5 ideas, you end up with 25 ideas. Guess what? Fully half of them are below the median. Okay, yes, I know the talk is going on if you're not laughing at that one. But you always, and when I say always, I mean always, you always get the top 10 or 15%. You always end up with 3 or 4 ideas that people say, wow, we can do that? Why, yes, we can. For $5,000 and in 5 weeks. The issue is, how do we organize people to collaborate and interact to take advantage of these 3 AI trends and to align those AI trends, I'd say their destinies, those AI destinies, to evaluate what kind of risks our customers, clients, and prospects are prepared or not prepared to take. I could run through a long lessons learned from having run these exercises, these workshops with a bunch of organizations, but I want to tell you the most important lesson that I've learned. When I began doing these exercises with people, these workshops with people, I thought the companies would end up being thrilled with the quality of the experiments and the ideas and the costs and everything. I thought this would be a transformation of their innovation culture, and that we would be bringing low-cost innovation risk management techniques and technologies to their organizations. Remember, I'm not a people person. It turned out that was not the big advantage. When I did surveys and focus groups and interviews with people, 2 weeks, 3 months, a year later, without exception, 3-to-1 ratio, the biggest impact, and I'm saying this at a university, at a school, the biggest impact that these workshops had was on professional development. Guess what? Bright people like it when they're pushed to collaborate and come up with creative things that they present to top management. This turned out to be less of an innovation exercise than a professional development exercise. May I suggest for our conversations this evening and tomorrow that we look through innovation through the window and lens, not just of how do we come up with novel and breakthrough ideas and prototypes, but how do we develop people better so that they're more comfortable thinking of themselves as innovators who are not just managing their own risks, but managing risks for the customers whose products and services and offerings they wish to serve. This is my last slide. It's a quote from that horrible institute. Alfred North Whitehead left England, was a philosopher, went to that hideous school by the not MIT, Harvard. But I really like this quote. Because what it basically says is we're not smarter than our parents, our grandparents, or our great-grandparents. What we have, in no small part, thanks to many of the people who are in this room tonight, are superior tools, techniques, and technologies. Okay? We don't have better imaginations. We have better tools and technologies that allow us to transform the economics of the fundamentals. What I love best about this quote, of course, is that it's from 1925. And the reality is, as everybody in this room knows and champions and believes, and in fact has as their ideology, the next 10 years are going to be even more interesting and innovative than the last 10 years in terms of innovation and opportunity and platforms. So, those are my comments. That's my email for those who want to flame it. If there are 3 or 4 questions for people who want to delay dinner still further, feel free to ask, or I'd be delighted to respond in any way. What kind of business model issues make sense? And if this were going to be a 90-minute workshop instead of a 30-minute talk, the question that I don't know if this is an appropriate question for an engineering school, but maybe it has to become an appropriate question for an engineering school, which is how do you align the innovation value that you bring to a customer or a client or a prospect with how you monetize that value? I think the most successful people in Silicon Valley and in Route 128 are those people who are every bit as nimble business model innovation as they are technical innovation. So that alignment question becomes key. Google's technical innovation, for the most part, hasn't been the same as its business model innovation. That said, they are beginning to figure out clever ways, and YouTube is a great vehicle. By the way, now let me step back and deal with the issue that I'm talking about in my book, which that just shows you what a great guy I am. I'm not spending the evening discussing a book that I'm writing. That's the other reason I'm not discussing it.
Now you're
teasing you, torturing me. We were talking about this with Web 2.0. What Google does way better than Pearson, and what Facebook needs to explore more. Web 2.0 companies make experimentation fast, quick, and cheap. So your ability to learn, accelerating iteration, your ability to test out not just new offerings, but new business models associated with that offering. If you don't, the experiment Pearson should do is on a dedicated 2-day course for something and say, if you give us $29 now, we won't show you any ads on this. Do a simple A/B test and see, does it make more sense to charge money or to sell ads? And then psychographically, do people self-select? Can you tell who wants one? Right now, it would cost you guys a lot of money to run that kind of experiment. Google and eBay can do that at a marginal cost. Your challenge is going to be changing your IT infrastructures to make experimentation to discover appropriate business models cheaper. Okay? From the man who's programmed his daughter's GPS. Yes.
Yeah. Jan John from State Street. Yeah. So
I won't make any John Garamandi Jerry Brown jokes.
All right. You wrote a paper a while back about the power of prototyping, I believe, and I've used that in Tom Peters talking about iteration and
yes.
Instead of doing detailed planning. But the problem is, I think most mainstream IT shops are still following waterfall. I mean, that's one of our methodologies.
The question from the gentleman was, after saying complimentary things about a paper I wrote on prototyping, he said that he observed that many, if not most, IT shops still follow the waterfall model. I am here to say, this is another 90-minute workshop, requirements are the devil. Requirements are evil. Nothing is more deceptive than requirements, because everybody in this room has listened to customers, done the requirements analysis, done the voice of the customer, circulated the requirements document, went away for 30, 60, 90 days, came back with a prototype, demoed the prototype, and what did your customer say to you? Well, I know that's what I asked for, but now that I've seen it, I realize, and this goes right back to the economics of innovation issue. How much does it cost your customer to give you a requirement? Nothing. But here's what's horrible. They think they're making your life easier by giving you more requirements because they're managing your risk by telling you what they need. It's a marginal cost to you, but translating that requirement is hardly a marginal cost for you. There's an asymmetric economic exchange going on here. I'm not embarrassed to tell you, for a decade, I made a very nice living going into organizations saying, stop after the first 15 requirements and build a rapid prototype and iterate around the requirement. Because customers are happy to throw out your work. They think twice about throwing out their work. Back to behavioral economics again. And they say, oh no, our customers won't do that. And say, it's fine. Here's how you do it. What you do is you get your CIO. Let's put it this way: if you have a stupid CIO, you're screwed anyway. Okay? What the CIO, and if you are a CIO, then you know this. The CIO basically says, "We're happy to do things on a requirement basis. It's going to cost more and take longer. That's the deal. If you prototype with us, it'll be faster and cheaper." You create a market mechanism. It's a choice. It's how you deal with a 2-year-old. Do you want to put on the blue shoes or the red shoes? You don't make it an issue of not wearing shoes. Okay? You create a choice that makes people realize there's a cost associated with lazily lobbing requirements as opposed to interactively developing IT products and services.
Final question from Michael.
I think people have suffered enough. Enjoy the dinner. Thank you.